everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar about changes to the Agricultural Land Easements sub-program of the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, known as ACEP-AL, as well as to the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, or RCPP, in the 2018 Farm Bill. My name is Chris Coffin. I am American Farmland Trust's Senior Program and Policy Advisor and a member of AFT's Federal Policy Team. I am joined today by Sanaz Arjamand, AFT's Federal Policy Manager, who has led our work on the 2018 Farm Bill. Before we get started, I'd like to review a few logistical items. First, we'll be recording today's call. We'll post the webinar and a number of 2018 Farm Bill resources on the Farmland Information Center website and send a link to it out to all webinar registrants. We've muted all attendees to avoid problems with feedback. Second, during the webinar, you will have an opportunity to ask questions. We'd like you to use the question feature to do this. You should see a control panel on the right-hand corner of your screen. It may be minimized. If you expand the box, you'll be able to type your question in and send it to us. We'll try to get through as many questions as we can during the allotted time. We'll also write up responses to all the questions we receive, even those that we don't get to during the call, and send a transcript out to all registrants following the webinar. If you were having any technical issues, please use the chat feature to let us know. We have AFT staff on hand to help and respond via chat. This will help keep technical issues separate from questions about the program. With that, I think we are ready to begin. Here's an outline of what we will be covering. We're going to spend some time first on ACEP-AL and have a Q&A section. Then we will talk about RCPP and have another Q&A section. And then we will focus on implementation and next steps. So let me turn it over now to Sanaz, who is first going to walk us through the changes Congress made to ACEP-AL. If you have questions during Sanaz's presentation, please write them using the question feature in the control panel, and we'll get to them during the Q&A section. So Sanaz, over to you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Chris. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Good. Well, thanks again, Chris, for that intro. My name is Sanaz Arjamand, and as Chris mentioned, I'm the Federal Policy Manager for American Farmland Trust, and I am going to be going through the legislative changes in the 2018 Farm Bill with you all this afternoon. But before we dive into those changes, we're interested in knowing who all we have on the line. So we have put together a really quick poll just to be able to gauge your experience in participating in ACEP-AL specifically. So if you could just take a moment to respond to this poll so we can get an idea of who we have on the line. Oh, I'm sorry, not sure why that's moving ahead.
Okay, Sanaz, I think we've got a critical mass, so we're going to close the poll.
Okay, that's great. So it looks like a fair number of folks on here have applied and have been successful. There are a handful of folks, almost 30%, who are thinking about applying for the first time. So wonderful. I will go ahead now and get started in talking about some of the changes that you can look forward to in applying to ACEP-AL. So the first thing that I am going to talk about was a big question as we were going through the 2018 Farm Bill discussions, how much funding would be available for ASAP. And you see it here in graphic form, just noting that this is funding that applies to both the agricultural land easements portion and the wetlands reserve easement portion of ASAP, which I won't be discussing during this webinar, but the funding is shared between the two. So you can see that over the 2014 Farm Bill, there was a stair-stepping up from $400 million to $500 million, and then the funding decreased in the last year of the bill down to $250 million. And that line on the graph indicates baseline funding. That was the starting point, essentially, for negotiations in this Farm Bill. So we saw a really big increase over the baseline amount of funding. ASAP is funded at $450 million for every year of the Farm Bill, which is really exciting from AFT's perspective, and it also means that looking forward even into Farm Bill's future, we're going to be starting with a much higher and much more comfortable baseline. Moving ahead now into some of the legislative changes, I just want to take a moment to explain the way that this presentation is set up. I know that it's pretty text heavy, but the goal was to be able to look at the 2014 Farm Bill and what changes were made in the 2018 Farm Bill so that you can see sort of where these differences in language have come up, and we hope that that's going to be useful to folks as we're thinking about responding to these legislative changes through the rulemaking process. So in places where you don't see anything in the right-hand box, that just means that there wasn't really a change from the previous language. So several of the program purposes remain the same. There is a change in the program purpose that relates to protecting agricultural land, and that is that non-agricultural uses that negatively affect agricultural uses and conservation values are now drawn out as being what needs to be limited to protect agricultural use. There's also a small change in the grazing uses language to indicate that the grazing land doesn't have to be restored and conserved. It can be restored or conserved. The next section of the legislation is the definition section. Much of this remains the same. Agricultural land easement, eligible entities, still state or local governments or land trusts, and eligible land still has the same categories for eligibility. And as a quick aside here, we're pleased from AFT's perspective that eligible land wasn't changed to expand it to also include forested lands, which we had felt would have further diluted the available funding away from farmland and ranch land. So we're pleased that that section remains the same. There are a couple of new definitions in this section, and these will be referenced again throughout the bill. First is that there's a definition for buy, protect, sell transactions. And these are transactions where entity-owned land, land owned by a land trust, can be eligible for ASAP AO under certain conditions. The first is that if it's transferred to a farmer or rancher either prior to or right at acquisition of the easement, or there's an option for an entity to have up to 3 years after the acquisition of the easement to transfer that land to a farmer or rancher. There are also some stipulations for extension as deemed appropriate by the Secretary and repayment of ASAP AIL funds in the cases where land is not transferred. There's also a new definition for a monitoring report, and that very simply is a report that's completed by the easement holder to document compliance with the terms of the easement. In the availability of assistance section, there are a couple of changes here. The first one of note is that what previously had referenced an agricultural land easement plan now references just a conservation plan which applies to highly erodible cropland. So this is going back to more 2008 Farm Bill language. And we'll talk more about the AIL plan being removed in other sections of the legislation. Funding is also provided for buy, protect, sell transactions, as was explained in the previous slide. There's now a change in how the non-federal share of the funds can be created by the entity. So the federal share remains at 50%, and the non-federal share is now flexible rather than being a required 25% cash match. It can be any combination of cash, landowner donation, costs associated with securing the deed, and other costs as deemed appropriate by the Secretary. There are a couple of examples of costs associated with the deed that are given in the legislation. Those are costs of appraisal, survey, inspection, and title. And that same 75% exception for grasslands of special environmental significance is maintained so that those types of projects are eligible for higher levels of federal funding. The next section of the bill is the evaluation and ranking section. There aren't a lot of changes to the existing language, but there is some additional language here that allows the Secretary to adjust the criteria established to better account for geographic differences in the way farming is done from state to state. So we're hopeful that that will provide additional flexibility in ranking projects. There's also some language that states that the Secretary may choose to give priority to applications that maintain agricultural viability. And there's some additional detail about what components of agricultural viability are that are included in the report language, anything that might enable the producer to productively operate a farm, maintain a long-term affordability, and maintain the land in a way that enables its future use by the next generation of farmers and ranchers. The next section of the bill talks about agreements and also the minimum term. So not a change in the length of agreements, but in the section that discussed the stipulations for entities being able to use their own minimum terms and conditions, there are a couple of changes. You'll note the first couple of bullets here are the same, but there's some additional clarification for the right of enforcement of the Secretary to explain that that does not extend to a right of inspection unless the easement holder isn't submitting timely and accurate monitoring reports based on the definition in a previous slide, or in cases where the Secretary has a reasonable and articulable belief that there has been a violation, then that would extend to the right of inspection. And in those cases, the USDA would have to notify the eligible entity and the landowner of the inspection and give them a reasonable opportunity to participate in that inspection. Now, here again, we see also the removal of references to the agricultural land easement plan that was permanently in the section of the bill that talked about the permanent minimum deed terms required in the easement. That has been removed and replaced instead with, as I mentioned before, a conservation plan that applies to highly erodible cropland. This next section is new to the 2018 Farm Bill. It goes into some detail about additional permitted terms. Both of these changes are really taking things that were done from our perspective in the regulations and putting them into the more stable legislative realm. So the first change here you'll see is that additional permitted terms and conditions intended to keep land under ownership of a farmer or rancher are specifically allowed in this bill. And in the explanatory statement, this is the examples of the option to purchase at agricultural value or preemptive purchase right, as it's known in some places. Those are specifically called out. In addition, there is some language in here that talks about instances when subsurface mineral development would be an additional permitted term. It's subject to applicable state law, and you'll notice that the first bullets may sound sort of familiar as those things that are in section 178 of the 170H of the IRS code, that this subsurface development has to have a limited and localized impact, not harm the agricultural use and conservation values, and not alter the topography. There's also a requirement for a mineral development plan that would be approved by the Secretary. This would have to stay within the impervious surface limitation and the minimum deed term requirements, and that the land would have to be reclaimed and restored after any subsurface mineral development takes place. And then this last row is more of just a catch-all, noting that there could be other additional permitted terms as determined necessary by the Secretary. A couple of other things here that remain the same. Substitution of projects are allowed, and the same rules apply to when a Secretary may choose to terminate an agreement with entities or require a refund. In the next section about certification, the process remains the same. It needs to be established by the Secretary, but there is additional language here that underlines again that certified entities may use their own terms and conditions as long as they're consistent with the purposes of the program. Again, not necessarily something that hadn't happened, but just providing further emphasis. The bottom row, you'll see the previous criteria that were required of the entity to become certified. That remains in place. There are now 2 additional paths that an entity could take to become certified. The first is that the entity would be accredited by a Land Trust Accreditation Commission or other similar group as determined by the Secretary, and have completed successfully at least 10 federal ag land easements, not necessarily just under ASAP-AIL. This could also have been under the Farm and Ranch Lands Protection Program. The second additional path is that a state agency, like a State Department of Agriculture, that has successfully completed 10 federal ag land easements would also be eligible to become certified. The same rules apply for reviewing an entity's certification and for terminating an entity's certification if necessary. No changes here. The language about length of enrollment remains the same, and there is a change, again here sort of a technical change, just noting that technical assistance won't apply to agricultural land easement plans because those are no longer requirement. This next administration section, just noting that it applies both to wetlands reserve easements and agricultural land easements. It comes in a later section in the bill. The ineligible lands mostly remain the same, still needs to be public, private land and land that isn't already under an easement. There is a small change that notes that lands with permitted or existing rights-of-way would be ineligible rather than just a proposed right-of-way as it had read before. The administration on subordination, exchange, modification, and termination does look fairly different in the 2018 Farm Bill. You'll see in the column on the left that all of these actions used to be included sort of under the same bar. These have now been broken out, as you'll see on the column on the right, to have differing levels that need to be reached in order for any of these actions to take place. So for subordination, including for energy transmission, that must have a limited negative effect or potentially increase the conservation values, minimally affect the acreage, and be in the public interest or further the practical administration of the program. For a modification or exchange action, that must have no reasonable alternative. The effect on the interest in the land needs to be avoided or minimized as much as possible. It needs to result in equal or increased conservation values, in equal or greater economic values to the U.S., remain consistent with the original intent and purposes of the program, and be in the public interest or further the practical administration of the program. So a somewhat higher bar as we go down this list. To terminate an easement, it must be in the interest of the federal government, must fully compensate the U.S. for the fair market value interest in the land, and any other costs deemed appropriate by the Secretary, needs to address a compelling public need with no practicable alternative, even with avoidance and minimization, and further the practical administration of the program. Just as in the previous Farm Bill, there was a requirement to notify in writing the House and Senate Ag Committees 90 days before taking any such action, so that remains. And there is a slight change also to the involvement of the landowner and eligible entity. In the previous bill, the Secretary was supposed to work with the landowner and eligible entity. In the 2018 Farm Bill, the Secretary needs to obtain consent from the landowner and the eligible entity, if applicable, on any of the actions that I've just gone over. There are also some slight changes in the land enrolled in other programs. Most important for ASAP-AL is just noting that if land is subject to an agricultural land easement, it may still be entered into a conservation reserve program contract in some cases. And there are not any changes to the conservation compliance requirements to protect wetlands and highly erodible lands. So that brings me to the end of the legislative changes, and Chris has been looking over your questions in the chat box. So Chris, I'm ready to take any questions.
Right. So thank you, Sanaz. That was great. I think we're going to do this. We will, I will pose some of the questions, and to give Sanaz a little bit of a breather before she has to launch in about RCPP, I will answer the first couple of them and then pose a few additional ones to you, Sanaz. One question was, will the change that we talked about, particularly this relates to the definition at the beginning, make it easier to do agritourism and things such as weddings? I think that is the addition of the language on the definition section that says that negatively affects agricultural uses. I think that is the hope and intent, that that language will allow for practices that might be fully consistent with agriculture, which in some cases can be some types of agritourism. So this will certainly be an issue that will be one to flag during the rulemaking process and to provide input to NRCS on that front. But I think that is the intent, to move in that direction. The second question was, does a donation, when we talk about on the match and donation, does that mean a bargain sale? And yes, technically, what the match can be now can be either cash or donative value from the landowner, i.e. a bargain sale. There was a question on whether in some states where there have been land trusts that have done what is known as a pre-acquisition of an easement, whether the buy, protect, sell language would cover that. I think that is an outstanding question that, again, we will need to focus on during rulemaking. There was a question about how can funds be used for the development of a conservation plan? Can partners actually do the work around a conservation plan now required only on highly erodible land? Or is it still that NRCS would be the ones to do the conservation planning for the entity? I will turn that question to you, Sanaz, since I'm not sure that I know the answer to it.
Sure. So again, as Chris has noted, some of this, the practices that USDA will use to carry out these changes are sort of yet to be completely laid out in the regulation process. But because technical assistance is available for that, I think that it would probably be something that most folks would choose to turn over to NRCS. The way that we're reading the conservation plan is sort of the same requirements that happen under conservation compliance, just for the highly erodible cropland, in which case I think the process for setting up that plan is something that obviously the NRCS does a lot, but perhaps there would be openness to letting an entity do it as well. There is some language also in the report that encourages entities to work with landowners to take on additional conservation practices. So if something similar to the agricultural land easement plan is something that you're already doing, that's by no means discouraged by this change in the legislation.
Great, thank you. Okay, moving on. There's a question of when does the switch from AO plans go into effect? And in fact, there was another question of saying, are AO plans no longer required prior to acquisition of the easement? The AO plans have been removed. There's no longer any requirement related to AO plans. For the purpose of when this switch happens, we'll get to it more in the implementation section, because it will depend a little bit on how things are rolled out this fiscal year. So let's wait on that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. There was a question about, is the $900,000 adjusted gross income limitation still in effect? The answer to that is yes. However, very importantly, there is a conservation title-wide waiver of the AGI for land of environmental significance. So just note that there is a way to get a waiver from the AGI limitation for the AL program. There is a question related to mineral development, Sanaz, that I'm going to give to you, which was, does the mineral development language in this farm bill open farmland up to fracking?
Sure. So I think the answer there would probably, the best I can do at this point is to say it depends. In the report language, it's very clear that the managers, the leadership of the Senate and House Ag Committee didn't intend to open up a whole slew of land to mineral development that wasn't necessarily going to be developed. The idea is that it really applies more to lands where the subsurface mineral developments, subsurface mineral rights are severed from the surface rights, in which case the landowner may not always be the one to make the decision about whether mineral development will occur, and you need some flexibility to still be able to protect those large ranches often that they're working with. So I think some of that will sort of come into play on a case-by-case basis, depending on what the remediation plan might be, what the impacts on the topography would be, and how possible it is to do that in certain places without negatively affecting the conservation values. So I think it will continue to be sort of on a case-by-case basis unless there's some harder lines that are drawn in the regulation.
Okay, great. Thank you. I want to just amend what I said earlier about AO plans, because as Cam from Connecticut correctly points out, that where there are easements that have been that have not closed, that are for which funding has been obligated, I assume, and I am looking at Jennifer Dempsey with the Farmland Information Center as I say this, but I'm going to assume that those will still require AO plans as they are pursuant to the 2014 Farm Bill. But we will see. I'm getting yeses from our experts here in the Farmland Information Center. So thank you, Cam, for flagging that. So again, think about the elimination of the AO requirement as moment duly. Moving on, there are a number of different there is a question of can a non-accredited land trust qualify as an eligible? Yes, absolutely. That has always been the case and will continue to be the case. A non-accredited land trust can also qualify as a certified entity, because remember, the change in this bill has been that there was an existing pathway for any eligible entity that met certain requirements under the 2014 Farm Bill. There have been two additional pathways, one that is for accredited land trusts and another that is for state programs. So there are now three different pathways for certification. Again, this is an issue that we will need to want to clarify in the rulemaking process and to provide input to NRCS about this. But there was a similar question about county purchase of agricultural conservation easement programs. Are there any other?
Chris, I'm not sure if others had this issue, but you cut out a little bit when you were talking about the county programs. Could you just repeat that last part?
Yes, I'm sorry. Suddenly doing funny things. Can you hear me now?
I can now, yes.
So let me repeat that bit about the county programs. So like non-accredited county programs could still be eligible to become certified entities. They would continue to be eligible under the original pathway that is still in place, and that was what was put into the 2014 Farm Bill. So the 2014 Farm Bill. And then let me answer one additional question about accreditation and certification. It says, are accredited land trusts given preference for funding? There is nothing in the new language nor in the 2014 Farm Bill that gives preference to any entity over another, so that in fact there's no preference on funding to certified entities versus non-certified entities. It's still one funding pool that is a competitive process amongst them all. Sanaz, we need to switch over, but let me give you one last chance to add to anything that I said or clarify anything that I might have said that wasn't clear.
No, I don't have any additions or clarifications, but I'll just note again that we'll be sending out responses to questions that we didn't get to on the call. So if there is a clarification that you need, you can type that into the questions box and we'll be able to get to that. Okay, great. So now we're going to move on to the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. And let me just preface this by saying we are talking about it only in terms of as it relates to farm and rangeland protection. Obviously, it's a much bigger program that can be used for many additional purposes, but our focus is largely on the land protection aspect of it. And I just want to remind you that if you have questions either on RCPP or still on ALE, feel free to type them in here, and we will try and get to them in the RCPP question and answer. So, Sanaz, back to you on RCPP. Okay, great. So just the same as we did for ASAP, let's take a moment to gauge your past participation or interest in participating in RCPP. There should be a poll on your screen. I'll give folks a couple of minutes to click in. Okay, great. So we have got almost 3/4 of folks who have responded here. It looks like a fair number, almost 30% are already participating in an RCPP, and then almost half of folks who are interested in doing so in the future. So as Chris mentioned, I am going to be going through this a bit more quickly than I did with ASAP and hitting some of the highlights that might be interesting to folks who are looking to use RCPP as a way to protect farmland and ranch land. So for those of you who are familiar with RCPP already, that was started in the past Farm Bill to take the place of several geographic initiatives, like initiatives that were focusing on the Great Lakes and Chesapeake Bay. And the way that it worked is that a project partner would put together a project to apply to a certain geographic region, like say a watershed, and then would use certain covered programs to enroll producers, farmers, and ranchers in contracts. So in the case of farmland protection, that would have been ASAP. You could also have used EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, the Conservation Stewardship Program, and the Healthy Forest Reserve Program. Noting that now the Conservation Reserve Program and PL 566, which is the Watershed Protection and Flood Prevention Act, are now also included in the types of activities that will be carried out under RCPP. A big change in this bill is that contracts are now going to be specific to RCPP rather than necessarily going through the covered programs. So when you're thinking about the other NRCS programs that are covered programs, those are giving direction to the purposes of RCPP rather than the specific authorities. So this is going to mean that RCPP now is going to need its own set of rules and regulations, which it didn't have when it was operating under the authorities of other covered programs. Another change here is that the timing is a bit different. It allows for up to 5-year projects with an option to renew for another 5 years. And for both of those terms, the possibility for a 1-year extension. So there's a longer time frame to work. That renewal would be dependent on success of the first term, but potentially up to 12 years in an RCPP project. The funding mechanism for RCPP is different now as well. In the past, those 4 covered programs, including ASAP, gave up 7% of their funds to go into RCPP, and then another $100 million per year was added to that amount. So NRCS was trying to take at least 7% of that 7% of funding that came from ASAP to put towards farmland and ranchland protection purposes. This is different in the 2018 Farm Bill. RCPP has its own funding pool, and it's now funded at $300 million per year. The 7% contribution from covered programs has been removed. So any funding that a project partner might get for farm or ranchland protection is going to be above and beyond the $450 million per year that is available through ASAP. There's been a change as well to the funding pools. You might remember that there used to be 3 funding pools: critical conservation areas, national and state. These have been combined to 2 funding pools that are evenly split between state or multi-state projects and critical conservation area projects. The critical conservation areas, there's still a limit of 8 of those throughout the country, but there is a bit of a difference now in how projects that relate to a critical conservation area will be chosen. Projects in that CCA need to address a priority resource concern for that area, and it's up to the Secretary to choose one or more priority resource concerns for each critical conservation area. Another relatively big change in RCPP comes in the section that talks about grants and alternative funding agreements. The USDA can carry out up to 15 of these per year. And under this type of agreement, project partners would be directly providing conservation services to farmers and ranchers rather than necessarily going through USDA. So there are a couple of examples of the types of projects that this might include. That could be infrastructure investments that would benefit multiple producers, or innovative approaches to funding like performance-based payments or environmental services markets. So this is, again, something fairly new that would need to be further detailed in the regulatory process. There are a couple of pieces of language in the RCPP section also that are aimed to make it an easier program for partners to use. There's a call for a simplified application process, and it clarifies that in-kind contributions will count as a match, and also that in the time between a project selection and the signing of the formal partnership agreement, if there is any outreach or other type of work that is going on for the RCPP project, that work would also count as matching funds. I wanted to include a couple of other changes here. We talked about this a bit in the Q&A section before. The adjusted gross income limitation is still at that $900,000 level, and as Chris mentioned before, there is the opportunity now title-wide to have a waiver for projects of special environmental significance. That was already in place for RCPP, so not necessarily new, although it applies to the entire conservation title, but it is something additional for ASAP. There's also some language that applies to the entire title regarding environmental service markets that states that the Secretary won't prevent participation in this type of market as long as it's not counter to the purposes of the conservation program, and the purpose of the market is to facilitate additional conservation benefits above what that producer might be getting from participating in the conservation program. So those are some pretty quick and high-level descriptions of changes in RCPP, and I am ready to hear questions from the audience. Chris.
Great, thank you, Sanaz. There are not a large number of questions about RCPP, but let me field the few that we have. One is, will current RCPP agreements still use ASEP, ALE, and other programs? I think we would assume that the answer is yes on that. Again, if these are signed RCPP agreements with obligated funding that came through the 2014 Farm Bill, I think the assumption would be yes, they would still be subject to the rules and any program requirements from the 2014 Farm Bill. There is a, let me see, this is a similar question. If we are operating under a current RCPP selected during the 2014 Farm Bill, will a new farmland protection project started this year under the 2018 Farm Bill follow 2014 or 2018? I am looking at all the experts here in the room, and Sanaz, I don't know that we know the answer to that, but I will defer to Sanaz if you do.
No, I'm afraid I do not at this time. We'll be talking about sort of the remaining questions that we have about implementation. I'm afraid that is still something that we need the chance to ask and get some more detail on.
Right, I agree. Okay, we'll see what we can find out. And again, as we put all of these answers to these questions, to the extent that we can get insights from NRCS at this point in time, we will certainly include those. There is a question on, are there match requirements for RCPP? Again, that is an excellent question. For the purpose of thinking, I think the short answer is we do not know what that will look like because, again, for the purpose of RCPP, these are going to be agreements that will not use all of the requirements for ACEP-ALE, so there would appear to be an opportunity for a difference in what that match might look like. Again, Sanaz, I would ask you whether that is your impression as well, and that this would be just something that would be focused on during rulemaking.
Well, I guess I would say for the RCPP project overall, I don't believe that there is a specific requirement from my recollection of the legislation. So for a project partner putting together a broader RCPP project, I don't think that the way that they've done the match has changed. It's just that they're more they're allowing in-kind contributions to also count as part of that match. In terms of match within an ACEP-like project under RCPP, I'm not exactly sure what that would look like, although I would assume it would take into account the same sort of flexibility that's now in ACEP-ALE under those match changes. So, you know, all the things that we've talked about with RCPP are pretty different from the status quo. So it's a bit of conjecture, I think, what those specific RCPP contracts will look like and how different they may or may not be from how we've been operating already.
Great. Okay, the last one for you, Sanaz, is the question, does the 5-year renewal option for RCPP include additional funding in the same amount as the original award?
Ooh, that is a great question. And I would have to look back at the legislative language. I am not sure if it stipulates that the funding will be the same amount. My guess would be, since you're, so that renewal would be, you would propose additional conservation work, and so my assumption would be that you would have a different amount requested for what you're proposing in the renewal. But I can certainly do some deeper digging to get back on that.
Right, right. And then the last one, we don't have the time to answer it, but I will say only this. It was a thoughtful question about, can we share some insights on what we see as the most successful RCPP projects thus far, and are they multi-state or single-state? What kind of resources are getting the most funding awards? In terms of the most successful RCPP projects related to, that include farm or ranch land protection, I think that is an excellent future subject for a webinar. So I think I'm going to say about that, that would be something that AFT would offer to put together some conversation, whether it's a webinar or some kind of teleconference with those partners around the country who are especially interested and looking for insights from other land trusts and state and county programs around what has worked for them. So with that, we need to stop and turn to implementation. which is a little bit, I think we had hoped at this point in time that we might know a little bit more, but the government shutdown has impacted the ability of USDA officials to talk much about what the plans are. So let me turn to Sanaz to talk through briefly what we know.
Great, thank you, Chris. Yes, as Chris noted, unfortunately, given that the USDA is one of the agencies that's being impacted by the partial government shutdown, things haven't been operating in a business as usual way, and so there is some limited information and ability to get responses about what new enrollments will look like in the coming fiscal year. We do know that the current Farm Bill grants the USDA the authority to operate under regulations from the 2014 Farm Bill for another fiscal year, as they are creating regulations for the current 2018 Farm Bill. But we also know that they recognize that there are several changes in both ASAP and RCPP that might make the programs easier for entities and project partners to participate in. And so they want to be able to take those into account as much as possible. So the information that we've gotten is that we should have a much clearer picture of how this will work for fiscal year 19 projects by the spring. This for ASAP-AL specifically, that we'll be hoping to see what that next set of enrollments will look like by sometime in the spring. And of course, we'll keep folks posted as much as possible about any information that we receive in the meantime. A lot of these projects are going to be, or a lot of the rules and regulations are going to be happening concurrently for different programs. So for ASAP-AL and EQIP and RCPP, which is going to be a really big one considering that it will need an entirely new set of rules. NRCS is definitely going to be working hard to get all of that organized. And then remembering that NRCS is now under the FPAC umbrella at USDA. So it's under the same sort of purview as the Risk Management Agency and the Farm Services Agency under the Farm Production and Conservation umbrella. So there are a lot of moving pieces in all of that that are hopefully going to be clarified in the coming months. The USDA has shared that their goal is to have these new rules completely in place and ready to go for fiscal year 20. So that is about as much as we know. And Chris, I will turn it over to you to talk about what we'll be doing as we wait to hear more and as we learn what the process will be.
Great. Thank you, Sanaz. If you look at this slide, you will see that we at AFT have a two-tiered strategy over the next few months. Our initial focus is on providing NRCS with early input from partners, such as all of you, on implementation priorities. This will be especially important if NRCS decides to move ahead with an interim rule for FY19. We know certainly what some of these priorities are. For ASAP, it's what can be counted as the match, how the buy, protect, sell language will be interpreted, the purposes language that we talked about early on, and the change that limits non-agricultural uses to those that negatively affect ag, questions around the certification process generally, and for RCPP, I think we have a number. We want to provide input to NRCS about how that funding will be allocated around between the various program purposes, to continue to have an ability to waive various ASAP eligibility requirements and what that would look like, and what the simplified application process might look like. But those are sort of some of the things that we know needs to be a focus around implementation. We are looking at additional and other ways to gather partner input for NRCS. And again, given the shutdown, we're waiting for USDA to reopen to be able to discuss options further with NRCS staff. We may try to do listening sessions. We may do a survey. We will certainly let you know more as soon as we know more. Our second focus will be on the proposed rules themselves. Once there are draft rules, we will put together another webinar to walk through the rules and to solicit feedback on them. We will then use that feedback to develop a draft set of AFT comments, which we will then share for feedback and thoughts from other partners and stakeholders. I would say in closing that we are excited and relieved to be done with the 2018 Farm Bill, and that we have an 18 Farm Bill, and to be switching now to a focus on implementation. We hope and we urge that all of you will remain engaged in this process, since your voices are really important at this point in time. And to make it easier for you to do this, I want to close by mentioning an exciting new initiative that AFT is launching this year to better engage agricultural land protection practitioners like all of you around federal and state policy, around protection strategies and innovations, around land access initiatives. We will be launching a National Agricultural Lands Network. I'll be directing this network and will be reaching out to many of you in the next few weeks for your thoughts on the type of information and engagement you would find most helpful. So when I said earlier around the webinar, for instance, on RCPP, that would be something that we will be likely to be doing. We are also planning a webinar or a teleconference specifically around Buy, Protect, Sell. So more details to follow. With that, I would like to close by thanking Sanaz for her excellent presentation of Farm Bill changes. And as a reminder, we'll be writing up the answers to the questions that were asked. If you didn't get a chance to submit a question, or it comes to you now or tonight or tomorrow, please feel free to email questions directly to Sanaz or me at the addresses on the screen. We can include those in all the questions that we already have received that we will be writing answers to. We will post all the materials, the webinar, and the questions and answers on the Farmland Information Center website, and send out an email when all of those materials are available. So thank you all for joining us, and take care.